Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Welcome and welcome back. This is the first of our summer evening lecture series talks for this summer. So really excited to have you all with us here tonight, both in person and out in the World Wide Web as well on Zoom. So I'm Nick Fisichella, President and CEO with Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. So welcome to Schoodic Institute. Welcome to Acadia's Research Learning Center, your Research Learning Center. So our role as a nonprofit conservation science organization is really to work closely in partnership with National Park Service and lots of other partners like Friends of Acadia to extend and enhance the really science capacity and expertise to support stewardship under rapidly changing conditions. So we love having all of you here with us. You know, this is a place for learning about our world. And then applying that science and really many ways of knowing to help steward nature amidst rapid change. And it's through our supporters that we're able to extend and enhance that capacity to do this work. So thank you for being part of that and supporting science and education and really the next generation of conservation champions. And also a big thank you to our corporate sponsor of our evening lecture series, which is Bar Harbor Bank and Trust. Thanks to their support, we're able to bring this to you all. And I'll just mention here real quick upcoming events, since this is the first time I've gotten to welcome you all. We have 4 evening lectures this summer. So in July 21, we have Designing Plastic Out of the Ocean Economy with Abby Barrows. August 11, one I'm really excited for, our own science communication specialist, Catherine Schmidt, will be giving a book talk about her book that I think is coming out today, Trees of Acadia, the Past, Present, and Future of Park Forests. So you can add that to your summer reading list and then hear directly from the author and special guests for that August 11th talk. And then September 8th, we have Skywatching, Human-Bird Relationships Through Time with Bonnie Newsome, Angie King-Johnson, and Olivia Olson. And then also just, you don't have to wait till July for our next event. Actually, in 2 days, we have local resident and author Margie Patlak, who will be giving a talk here just on Thursday on her new book, Insect Safari, Exploring the Wondrous World of Everyday Bugs. So that's all a lot to remember. So you can go to our calendar page on our website to check out events. There's lots of others coming up. You know, Wendell Gilley Museum is doing bird carvings here. We have some iNaturalist trainings, the Observe to Conserve. We have other night sky events, the Maine Outdoor Film Festival, all sorts happening. So do check out our calendar page. All right, so now I want to introduce our speaker for tonight. And I'm super, super excited for Dr. Peter Reich to be with us here this evening. Peter is a very world-renowned ecologist and scientist. He's the director of the Institute for Global Change Biology and a Philbert Roth professor at University of Michigan. He also is the Distinguished McKnight and Regents Professor at University of Minnesota and a Distinguished Professor International at Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment in West Sydney University in Australia. Peter conducts global change research on plants and soils and ecosystems, and his work is really about linking processes from the cell up to the global scale, really to better understand impacts of multiple global environmental challenges, including rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere, climate change, and biodiversity loss. Peter has helped pioneer the development of trait-based ecology and is active in building grassroots scientific networks. He's written some of the most cited papers in our field in ecology. So if you're a scientist in ecology, you've more than likely cited one of Peter's many, many papers. He's in fact the most cited ecologist, ecological scientist in the world. And really beyond that, his desire to connect everyone to science is truly extraordinary, and it goes beyond the scientific literature. Peter helped to launch the science education channel Minute Earth, and I think there's been over 750 million views of Minute Earth videos. So if you are not part of that 750 million, you can add that to your summer list as well. So I'm giving you a lot of homework tonight. You may not have been ready for that, but it's definitely worth checking out Minute Earth. And so at present, Peter's engaged in trying to learn how we can help society manage itself and its interactions with nature to sustain people and the planet. So with that, we'll hear from Peter about hope on a changing planet. Please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thanks much, Nick, for that introduction and for the invitation to come here and learn about all the great things that are going on here, which is very impressive. Well, until recently on a night like this, I would have spoken largely about trees and soils, climate change and biodiversity. But now that doing science is in some ways an act of civil disobedience, and that our jobs as scientists have expanded from understanding nature to also defending science and defending democracy, I feel that the focus of my interactions with audiences of scientists and the public needs to grow. So I've chosen to talk about not just nature in a changing world, but nature, people, science, and democracy in that changing world. And because times are troubled and people are struggling, especially in this country, to maintain hope in our shared future, I also want to help us discover, build, and maintain hope for nature, for solving human problems, and for us as a community. And so hope is an important theme of what I want to share today. And to get going on that path, I want to paraphrase what Anton Treuer, an Ojibwe thought leader and linguist, shared recently at a community forum I attended. We are not powerless, and because in a way we get to remake the world in miniature every day, if we approach that with intention, we can do a lot. So the forging of community, such as with events like this tonight, pulls us together and is a step towards solution. In that spirit, I want to thank you all for making the effort to show up tonight, and I'm looking forward to us having a conversation, hopefully if time allows, after my remarks. So, as you can see, the title of my talk tries to weave together hope, science, democracy, nature, and us on a changing planet. So how the heck do we do that? What are the questions? How do we link these things together? I have only partial answers to any of these, but hopefully in the next 45 minutes or so we can explore some of these connections. And I'll give you the take-home message right away. The bad part is that climate change is a greater threat to people and nature than you think. That's probably scary because probably a lot of you think it's already pretty scary. The well-being of nature and human society are also absolutely linked, so it's not like we have to or have the option of choosing to protect ourselves or protecting nature. We either have to protect both simultaneously or neither will be in good shape. And so then to get to the good part is despite these challenges, the drastic effects of climate change, anti-democracy, anti-science movements around the world, there is still huge reason for hope and reason to hope. And lastly, diversity actually can play a key role in helping that hope come to fruition. Diversity in many respects. So the topics for today, given that we are in Acadia National Park, and many of you do care about the ocean and the intertidal and the forest and other things, we will talk about our changing planet, climate change, impacts on biodiversity, and those in turn impacts of biodiversity on climate change regulation. But then we'll also focus on coupling those ecological processes with sociological and economic scientific questions. So by the year 2025, a fourth of the way through this century, almost every biome on the planet and its species were struggling with climate change. The cartoon on the right just shows visually biodiversity crashing over time as we get to the current era due to droughts, floods, winds, pests, heat waves, wildfire, and other challenges associated with climate change and other global change. But at the same time that species other than humans are struggling, by 2025, almost every biome and its people are also struggling with climate change due to the same droughts, floods, winds, pests, heat waves, and wildfire. So what's happening to human society and what's happening in nature are by no means separate things. And by 2060, and here's where the scary part comes in, global climate change will reduce global well-being every single year by as much as the worst years ever, including World War II and the Great Depression, in terms of economics, in terms of food security, in terms of human well-being. That's, is that just me, some crazy ecologist talking? Well, I'm not the one who made this 2060 claim, but the world's largest reinsurance company, Swiss Re. Now, most of you probably have no idea what Swiss Re is or what a reinsurance company is. They insure all the insurance companies of the world. So if anyone needs to understand risk, it's companies like that. And they're sounding the bell, much more of alarm bells, much more than academic scientists are. Because they've crunched the numbers and they don't look very good. And I'll share a few of them. In fact, here's one right now. Future damages are going to be really high everywhere in the world. And they use GDP as an index. It's been criticized that people say GDP is not a useful measure. It's very highly correlated with other measures of well-being, such as human health, human happiness, and others. So if you don't like GDP, just think of that as human well-being in some other form. But you can see almost every country in the world, from left to right, going from poorer countries to richer countries, is going to have a 5 or 10% minimum future loss in 2060 from climate change in every single year. But the poorer countries are going to have astronomically huge impacts on their well-being, 30, 40, 50, 60% a year. And these are because of impacts on food production and food availability, infrastructure, human disease, and health, tourism, and energy systems. And at the same time, as probably everyone in this room does know, emissions are higher in richer countries. So those of us in this room or who grew up and have lived in this country and all of our compatriots are to blame more than the average person in the poorer countries of the world. So there's a lot of injustice here. People who are not polluting as much as the rest of us are going to bear the damages much more so than we are. And those damages are happening or will happen to people in countries that have the least capacity to deal with those. So this is the bad news. The health of natural and human societies is under serious threat from us. But the good news is we can stop climate change and reduce social injustice. It would actually save us money, but we need to take science, democracy, nature, and all of us together to make this happen. So let's start with this idea of stopping climate change. Because we talked a lot about climate adaptation today. I'm all for adapting to climate change, but we simply cannot adapt our way out of this. We have to mitigate or stop climate change at the same time. And so there's two ways that you can think about this. One is you can decarbonize the energy system. That's the majority of what we need to do. But those of us who work in natural systems also are all about incentivizing carbon storage, not just in terrestrial systems, but in the oceans as well, because it plays an important, if secondary, role. And I'll talk about each of these, but I'll start with the part on land that I know more about. So, give us a framework for this. I'm going to have one slide here that I'm calling Carbon Cycle 101, like an introduction. So when you think about carbon emissions, where do they end up and what happens to them? So the bottom left, you can look at where all the CO2 emissions into the atmosphere come from. 89% come from burning fossil fuels, but 11% come from net land use change, in essence, deforestation. When we chop down forests, a lot of carbon is released from soils and from dead plants and from wildfires associated with it that goes into the atmosphere. Now, the good news is that over the last 70 years or so, as we've been pumping lots and lots of CO2 into the air, only 45% of it stays there every year. The oceans and land ecosystems are literally scrubbing more than half, 55% of the CO2 out of the atmosphere that we put in there every year. And that's actually an amazing service that they're doing. And the big question is whether they'll be able to continue doing that or whether we can enhance it. And that's through enhanced photosynthesis, and enhanced biomass, and enhanced soil carbon and land, and through the oceans, both through chemical and biological mechanisms, scrubbing CO2 out of the air and keeping it in the ocean, and actually having a lot of it go down at the bottom of the ocean as well. So the Earth has warmed by more than a degree C since 1900, which is about 2.5 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm sorry, it's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Without ocean and land sinks, the Earth would have already warmed by more than twice as much. And so this is literally a multi-quadrillion-dollar service that lands and oceans have provided. And the big question, well, two of them here is, can this service persist and can it grow? And then secondarily, can we combine it with other ways of stopping fossil fuel emissions to stop climate change? Let's think about this interface of climate change impacting ecosystems, feeding back to climate. So what happens as we change CO2 levels in climate and change the climate? What does it do to plants and ecosystems? In essence, what happens is we turn up the heat. It's a photo there of forests and lakes in northern Minnesota. It's a system a lot like northern Maine. And this question about what climate change is doing to ecosystems is something we know a lot about in many different systems around the world, because scientists have been studying this in the tropics, in the temperate zone, in the Arctic, on land and on sea. I'm going to, and we could spend an entire semester, 8 hours a day, talking about all those things, but I'm going to give you a brief summary about one system, which is where the arrow is pointing out. Again, this boreal high latitude system, such as you have in Maine, Michigan, Quebec, Ontario, Minnesota, and the like. So one of the big effects, as we're all aware of, is wildfire. In 2023, Canada broke its record for wildfires by 5-fold in terms of the land that was burned. I've always been super impressed by the September 5th map here, which shows in red dots all of the wildfires, and actually blue dots as well, all of the wildfires happening on a single day in Canada. But I'm not going to talk about fire, because climate change is already harming terrestrial ecosystems, even ignoring fire, even in cool, wet environments where you think, oh, a place like Maine or Minnesota or Quebec is cool and wet. Shouldn't climate change make things grow better? And the answer is more often than not, no, largely due to drying of the air and soil under climate change. As warmer conditions occur, plants lose more water, the soil dries out, and the air actually, although many of us don't like being in very humid environments, plants like it a lot. And as the air dries, they close stomates, which slows down their photosynthesis and growth. And so there's lots of data showing that forests in the north of this continent aren't doing very well. This is data from 20 years ago, well, 15 years ago now, showing increasing mortality of many major tree species across Canada's boreal forests. This is inventory data, so they have no idea what's the cause. Is it insects? Is it climate change? Is it something else? People like Nick Fisichella in his PhD work looked at this in a different way by going out and comparing temperate and boreal tree species and all those black dot sites in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan to see whether or not under warmer temperatures, the temperate trees like oaks and maples would do better and could invade into the boreal patches, and the answer was they could. So lots of people have been teaming up to look at these issues. I was part of a study looking at using tree ring data across all of Canada, looking at whether drier air, we have something called vapor pressure deficit. It's kind of like relative humidity, but standardized for temperature. So when the air is dry, and it's gotten drier, using tree rings, we're able to look at whether or not these two spruces, black spruce and white spruce, grew better or worse when the air was dry the previous summer. Blue shows they're doing better. Red shows they're doing worse. It doesn't take AI or a rocket scientist to come to the conclusion that neither of these tree species like dry air. They're growing more slowly everywhere, even in really cold wet places with drier air. And we've corroborated this with very local scale experiments, such as an experiment called Before Warmed that we run in 2 sites in northern Minnesota, where without chambers, we warm the air and soil and test the responses of different tree species to this. And what we found there is that spruce and fir, just like they're not doing well here, are also not doing well in our experiment when we warm them by 1.5 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees. Balsam fir on the left, white spruce on the right, their growth and their survival really plummets with even just a 1.5 degree warming. So they're not suited to even markedly warmer temperatures. But luckily, and this is a theme I'll come back to over the night, nature is resilient, and we're hurting it, and it's going to suffer, and elements of it are going to do poorly, but other elements of nature will come along and take up some, maybe most, maybe all of that slack. We don't really understand that yet. So other species might be able to compensate. Here's a 5-year growth of red maple and sugar maple in the same experiment. They grew a lot better and survived much better under the warmer conditions. And as we're seeing throughout Northeast North America, maples are expanding and growing better. So maybe we don't want change, but change that gives us healthy forests that are different than our current forests is better than change that gives us unhealthy forests. So we can hope that nature can help us be resilient, or nature can be resilient in the face of climate change and help us who rely on those forests for many services. Now, I'm going to expand out to the end of up to 2200, which we can only do with either a time machine or a model. And this is a model a group was using called iLand, where they simulated everything about a forest out day by day out to 2200 to look at whether or not these forests were sequestering carbon or not as climate changed. And what they found in this modeling study was that it really varied depending on whether you were a low diversity or a high diversity forest. And they did detailed work in 3 forests in 3 different continents. And their take-home message is this complicated graph here. The dotted line at 0 shows the difference between a carbon source and a carbon sink. Forest is a carbon source when every year it's giving back more carbon to the atmosphere and accelerating climate change through things like decomposition and fires. And it's a sink when it's growing more and storing more of the carbon in wood, live wood, dead wood, and in soils. And you can see these 3 different forests in this model universe are doing very different things. The Japanese forest with high diversity under the different colors are just different climate scenarios. In most of them, the blue one is just the reference line. It's actually storing a lot more carbon, so it's doing a good job. At the other extreme, the one in Grand Teton, that's a low diversity one in this model universe, is doing much more poorly and giving back more carbon. Now, because this is a model, we have no idea how accurate this is, but it does suggest that different forests might respond differently. And the authors of this paper came to the conclusion that forest reorganization, that if some trees die or do poorly and others replace them, will change the response to climate change. And so what we see in the first 5, 10, 15, 20 years of response to climate change may be very different than what happens 30, 50, 70 years down the road. And we can't just take at face value the initial responses. And the reason that biodiversity mattered in this, because the Japanese forest was much more diverse, is that biodiversity helps systems become more resilient, more productive and more stable through many different mechanisms, things such as niche complementarity, things such as being deep-rooted versus shallow-rooted, or doing well in dry years versus wet years. Facilitation is where one species might aid another through shade in hot days or through making soils more fertile. They're also escape from disease, because in diversity, every individual is at lower density and diseases and pests are less likely to find you. There's also ways in which plants and soils interact to make them more fertile. There's selection effects where if you have a high diverse forest, you're more likely to have the best performing tree there already than if you have a low diversity forest. And there's many other mechanisms that we put under this umbrella of biodiversity effects on ecosystem function. And I've been part of dozens of studies now in grasslands and forests, experiments and observations around the world, and this notion that biodiversity has positive impacts on the functioning of systems holds up on almost every one of those. And here's an example of one of them where we took data from more than 80 countries around the world and looked at if you lost tree species richness in a region below 100%, which was the maximum net zone, this is what happened to productivity. That red line shows as you lose any richness or diversity, you're losing productivity, but it really plummets if you lose a lot. And this was basically the same all over the world, whether you're talking about the tropics or the temperate zone or the boreal zone. And this is observational data, and as I mentioned, experiments show the same thing. And this is for the productivity, how much more tree, wood, and leaves and roots are growing. But we also look at the impacts of diversity on soils. This is a study from Canada where we used Canadian inventory data and found that more diverse forests, and all the red dots in the left there show the sites, that the forests that were more diverse actually increased their soil carbon by more than 30% in 10 years. And so diversity matters for the ability of forests to take up carbon and hold them, both in wood and soil, and help to slow climate change. So this notion of linking biodiversity and climate change and climate regulation is an important one. So get back to this notion that the Earth is warmed by a degree C. I would have warmed by more than twice that without these sinks. To stop climate change, we need to enhance the quadrillion-dollar service that's already happening, and we want to enhance it as well, which is where the whole notion of nature-based solutions come in. How many in this room have heard of the term nature-based solutions? And yeah, a lot of you have. It's the idea that by planting forests, maintaining forest health, we can store more carbon, or we can use no-till agriculture to store more carbon in the soil. And so models also show that by the end of the century, terrestrial ecosystems will continue to sequester more carbon because of CO2 fertilization and longer growing seasons. So the red line and the blue line are two different climate scenarios. Again, the black line at 0, below that means that terrestrial ecosystems will be giving carbon back to the atmosphere as opposed to scrubbing it out of the atmosphere. And this model at least suggests that this service will continue to the end of the century. But the positive effects of longer growing seasons and more carbon dioxide in the air are offset by more water stress, by heat waves, fire, and pests. And so can we enhance this by managing our systems in a way that they store more carbon? And I've come up with what I call the 1% rule to help me think about this. And it's the premise for why the whole idea of enhancing the landscape is even worth thinking about. It comes down to the fact that there's 4 times as much carbon in plants and soils as there is in the atmosphere. So when you just look at the total amount in the air versus plants and soils, and there's 300 times as much carbon in plants and soils as are emitted by humans each year. So there's a huge storehouse of carbon there. And if we can make a 1% increase in global productivity, something called gross primary productivity for scientists in the room, and a 1% decrease in carbon losses from soil respiration and wildfire, that would offset 1/5 of annual emissions. Now, I usually ask at this point to anyone in the room who's a scientist whether you've ever measured anything in the lab or the field with precision at 1 or even 2 or 3%. And I've never seen anyone raise their hand. So we need to change something that's below our detection level. So it's not much of a change. But we need to do it in all different systems and everywhere on Earth. And that's the big challenge, is somehow we have to modify what we do to help our systems hold on to a little bit more carbon and give back a little less to the atmosphere. So there's promise in this. I'm going to show a series of slides borrowed from Project Drawdown, which if you're not familiar with, you should look them up online. They talk about lots of ways of slowing and stopping climate change. And these are just some photos to illustrate some of these ideas. Things such as additional avoided conversion, which is a complicated way of saying don't cut the forest, just keep the carbon there, don't let it go back in the atmosphere. Protecting grasslands, restoring tropical forests, conservation agriculture, which includes a variety of different techniques, tree intercropping and tree plantations on degraded lands. They have about 15 other photos like this that illustrate other ways of trying to do this. And there is promise in this when you actually look at it from a statistical and data standpoint. I was part of a project with about 80 other scientists where we used that inventory data from the 80 countries around the world and remote sensing data to estimate the amount of potential to store more carbon in forests around the world, only using existing forests, not stealing land from agriculture or from cities, by estimating how much carbon there would be if we actually allowed those forests to have more trees and larger trees. And the answer was 200 to 250 petagrams of carbon. Now, if you're like me, I have no idea what 200 petagrams means. So instead, I translated it again to this relative effect. And if by 2075, we even achieved a third of that, because achieving all of that extra carbon in forests is not going to happen, even achieving a third of that would cut additional climate change by 1/6. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's a meaningful chunk of what we need to do to slow climate change. And here's a case where to do this, we really just need to think about our forests and start managing them in a different way. So let the trees live longer, leave more of them there, and actually manage them so that there's more trees in every forest on average. And the reason there's so much potential is because as you drive around the landscape, the average forest you see isn't a majestic forest full of giant old trees, right? It's kind of scraggly, there's trees missing, they don't look very healthy. And so simply by leaving them alone to a certain extent and allowing them to grow, we can store a lot more carbon. Now, there's other people who come up with even more optimistic numbers than we do. A group led by someone named Girardin et al. Published a paper a couple years ago that claimed that there's enough capability in agricultural and forest and wetland systems by protecting, managing, and restoring them to offset 50% of our annual increase in atmospheric carbon from burning fossil fuels. Again, they weren't saying we're going to make this happen. They're saying this is a real opportunity to do some of this. So hopefully convince you that there's at least potential to enhance this multi-quadrillion-dollar service by storing more carbon on land. And then can we really get to the finish line, so to speak, of stopping climate change by combining it with decarbonization and do so in a way that enhances social justice. And so far, I've been talking about this number 4 with the arrow shows of sequestering emissions in nature as one of the pathways of global decarbonization. But the other things we need to do that fall into the realm of other parts of sustainability are decarbonize electricity, electrify everything, and increase efficiency, which we are on the path to doing around the world. And the solutions are things we've heard about for decades now. Adopt green agriculture that is more energy efficient, increase energy efficiency and reduce use in autos, buildings, and land use agriculture, increase renewables, and keep carbon and other greenhouse gases on land. So it's a question of figuring out a way to help society make this happen. And we can do this decoupling of emissions while enhancing well-being of people even in poorer regions of this country and other countries. Because in a paper we published last year, we're able to look at the data from around the world and see that many low-income countries can actually reduce emissions yet advance well-being and justice in their economies. There's been a paradigm or dogma in a lot of the developed economic world for decades that we have to allow the developing countries to burn lots of fossil fuel to advance their economy, and that we can't even ask them or think of working with them to slow that down because it would be against their best interest. But in fact, because wind and solar are cheaper than burning fossil fuel, it actually doesn't hurt their economy to become more sustainable. And in fact, when we think more broadly, for all of us on the planet, it's actually too expensive not to stop climate change because it's actually going to cost us a lot more money if we don't stop climate change. Here's a bunch of papers from academics, economists, and some of the leading consulting companies of the world that consult corporations. And their estimates are that to stop climate change, it would cost about between 0 and 2% of global GDP over a 20-year period, which is a lot, but it's a lot less than the greater than 5 to 10% of damages to our economy from climate change that will increasingly happen in the near future. And so the notion that somehow it's too expensive to stop climate change is actually totally wrong. We need to do it, and the sooner we do it, the better it is from an economic standpoint. I'm not showing it here, but there's analysis by some US economists that the damages to the economy from climate change are so great that it's in the economic of large economies like US and China to stop climate change unilaterally, even if no one else does so. Because even the amount of climate change reduction that would be made by an individual country like the US or China decarbonizing would stop enough of the negative effects that it's worthwhile. So we can enhance the way we store carbon on land and use natural services. We could combine it with just decarbonization, but will we? So it's not really a question of, we don't need new technology. We don't need, all we need is to figure out how to get us, individuals, companies, governments, to do something about this. And here's where I come back to this notion of hope on a changing planet. Science, which is what some of us in this room do, helps support nature, people, and justice, and democracy as those things play a role in enhancing well-being of people and nature. And so one of the first things I've gotten to think about more and more is we've learned that biodiversity really matters for nature, for natural ecosystems, and for the benefits we get. Do those rules apply to human systems? And I'm just going to show one slide of work I'm doing with a colleague from the business school at Michigan who's an economist, and where we asked whether the rules about biodiversity apply to business diversity. So each county in the US, over a 17-year period, we had data on the diversity of businesses. So were all the industries in a given county the same, or were they really different? The different colors just show the diversity across those 17 years, across all the counties. And the answer is yes, the counties with greater industrial diversity, more types of businesses, were more productive and stable from 2007 to 2024 for the same basic reasons that ecological theory predicts it will happen in natural systems. When you have more diversity, you're able to ride out downturns in specific industries, you'll be able to use resources in different ways and employ different people. Well, democracy is under attack, as are science, truth, diversity, justice, and the rule of law. And I have this notion that perhaps political repression and disinformation are bad for many reasons, but including the fact that they result in a loss of idea diversity that reduces the efficient resource use, productivity, and stability of that country. And here's data from a paper a number of years ago now, where they tried to test this by looking at the level of democracy in individual countries in relation to the effectiveness of their government. Now, they had to do a lot of coming up with indicators of democracy and indicators of government effectiveness. But when they did this, by and large, what you see is that the countries that have greater levels of democracy, Switzerland's, New Zealand's, Finland's, Sweden's of the world and the like, tend to have the more effective governments. And the ones like North Korea and Somalia, Central African Republic, and others that have low levels of democracy tend to have the lowest level of government effectiveness. There are a few outliers, places like Singapore and Malaysia, which are not very democratic but tend to be somewhat effective. But by and large, there's a relationship here. And in the data that we were looking at, partially from Swiss Re and partially from other World Bank sources, strongly democratic countries are also less vulnerable to climate change. Now, it's only partially due to their being more democratic. There's other things in this, but in general, it also applies. So where do we find hope in a world full of anti-democracy and anti-science movements if we think democracy and science are useful for helping society, including stopping climate change. I'm going to give two different examples here to end with. One is from a lecture I heard from Paul Polman recently, who was a CEO of Unilever for about 10 years, and then put out this recent book on net positive, who really thinks that multinational companies can and should be the global leaders in stopping climate change because of the scale and leverage and speed that they have. For instance, they control the global supply chains involving energy, land use, agriculture, materials, and logistics, which is where a lot of the impacts on climate change and diversity occur. And so they can drive change via changing the procurement standards, product design, and capital allocation. They can also move faster on renewables, deforestation-free sourcing, fertilizer and pesticide reduction, and circularity than governments can. We all know how slow almost every government on the planet is at making these changes. And he also said and thinks that the economic self-interest of corporations increasingly align with sustainability because he argues the business case is that you have lower energy costs from efficiency and renewables, so like why not do them anyway? In a world that has greater sustainability and less climate change, you have reduced supply risk. By doing the right thing, you also build up reputation and can get license to operate benefits, like if the EU puts standards on the way you behave as a corporation. And also as investors price climate risk in, there'll be better access to capital. So a lot of these kind of high-level economic factors, he claims, should help corporations become leaders in this. Now, at the very other end of the scale, we can think of individual people and communities. And the example I'm going to give here are the people of Minnesota, one of my homes, state a lot like Maine in many respects, a place where democracy not always but often works, and where it sometimes bends towards sustainability, maybe increasingly. I'm going to give three examples from climate mitigation, food security and justice, and democracy. The first is about climate mitigation, and in 2023, the state did pass a clean energy standard which requires utilities to provide 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. If you look at all the blue states down below, those are the other states that also have those kind of targets, and Maine also has that target now, and by 2040 as well. We can look at food security and justice. Also in 2023, the state passed a program called Free School Meals Program, which gave free school breakfast and lunch to all K-12 students. The red states there, red in color, not in political affiliations, are the other ones that do. I put a question mark for Maine because Maine actually has a similar program, but I think it's not shown here because it applies only, I believe, and someone in the audience can correct me, to public school, whereas in Minnesota it applies to every student in every school. But it's good that this is happening. And the last point is that the people of Minnesota resisted illegal and unconstitutional federal government repression and intimidation by coming out in the streets to support their neighbors. And they were successful, which gives hope. And the people in Maine, although it wasn't quite as intense a surge, it was a surge nonetheless, and it's still happening in both states, also came out to resist the same illegal and unconstitutional behavior on the part of our government. So those things give me hope. So we'll go back to our take-home message. Climate change is real. It's an enormous threat. It's an existential threat, like Barack Obama said a decade ago. And it's a greater threat than we think. If we don't solve this thing, people in the world are going to be in a lot of hurt, and especially the poor people of the world. In order to fix this, we need to start thinking about nature and human society is absolutely interlinked, and that fixing or maintaining or sustaining one requires sustaining the other. But the good news is that despite these challenges, whether it's climate change or anti-democracy movements or anti-science, there's a lot of reason for hope and reason to hope, and diversity can play a key role in this. And the last thing I want to leave us with is that hope is talked about by many, including Bruce Springsteen, who came to support the movement, the last No Kings rally in Minnesota. in March that is, hope is a conscious choice and an act of resistance. It's a verb and a noun, and it is the power of community. So I hope I've given you some hope here tonight, and I'm hoping that we can have a conversation if we're not chased out of the building anytime soon. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. And now we've come to the question and answer portion of the evening. And one of the things I didn't mention when I introduced Peter, Peter was my PhD advisor. And so one of the things when you're earning a PhD, you have to go through preliminary exams and then your final defense. And during those exams, your advisor and your committee, which is made up of other professors, they get to ask you any question that they can think of, really hard questions. And so tonight we're going to turn the tables a little bit now, and I want you all to help me with thinking of some really hard questions to ask Peter. Do we have any questions in the room? Folks are thinking.
Are there any consequences for, I guess, businesses or like more local governments in those states for not reaching the 100% clean energy goals?
Yes, I'm sure that I'm not an expert in that, but those are laws, and so the utilities are a funny quasi-private, quasi-governmental entity, and so in this day and age, things happen that you think never could happen. In theory, they have to comply with the regulation from the state. And given the timeline that things happen on, it's not like the government's not going to pay attention and just look at 2040. And so there's lots of time for the utilities, if they're dragging their feet, for the state regulatory commissions that will interact with them to lean on them and talk to them. And so I think in most states, actually I think most states are ahead of the schedule on these kinds of things. They're actually getting to their targets in advance, in part because the utilities, now it's a little different talking about existing plants, but it's economically makes much more sense to build a new renewable energy source than to build a new gas or coal-fired power plant. And so there's also strong economic incentives to do what the state is telling you as well. So, great question, though.
Organizations. Hi, thanks. There are also in Minnesota quite a number of very active nonprofits who are environmentally oriented, who have strong legal teams. So they also keep an eye on what's going on, and if the state government is not fulfilling its obligation, they hear from many of these environmental organizations that have very strong legal interests. So there's another level of watchdog, which is been super effective. And there's also a strong level of non-NGOs or nonprofits working in collaboration on these issues. So they actually help advise the government, they help work with the utilities. So that's kind of an interesting collaborative effort.
And so kind of on the same point, although there's lots of progress in the US on electricity power being generated by renewables, we're lagging the rest of the world by a lot in EVs. Like many other countries have transitioned to far more EVs and are powering those EVs through renewables much more than we are. And that's something that is really hard to manage at a state level in the same way as you can a utility. So there's lots of things we haven't figured out yet that still need to happen. And the rest of the world is leaving us behind in a lot of these things, which is going to hurt our economic competitiveness in the future. It already is. Other countries, including China, are the leaders in a lot of renewable technology, not us. And there's going to be a lot of money made in that. And so one of the things I often say is, another reason I have hope is is that greed will eventually prevail in those corporations, and they'll start to do the right things because they're going to make more money doing it. And I think that's actually part of what's going to happen.
Thank you for a great lecture. I wonder if you could speak to the issue of ocean acidification and how that's playing into the entire analysis of future prospects for the planet.
Yes, great. So ocean acidification is part and parcel as the oceans absorb more CO2, which is great for the climate temporarily, but it also acidifies the ocean, which has negative effects everywhere and is a major problem. And in fact, maybe it's a slight digression from your question, one of the solutions to climate change that people have promoted is to inject aerosols in the outer atmosphere, which sounds ludicrous, but actually could be done, and wouldn't that be that expensive in a grand scheme of things by literally injecting it in the air from airplanes, is that would basically create like a screen that keeps some of the sunlight, 1% or so, from getting to the Earth, enough to stop climate change, but it would do nothing about ocean acidification, actually accelerate it, because we keep burning fossil fuels and make ocean acidification worse. So that's one particular solution, which is a terrible, in my opinion, idea, because it's going to leave a major, major impact intact or make it worse. And also, I don't trust that we can globally engineer the world in a way that's going to work, given our track records. I don't want to personally trust us to monkey around with the atmosphere itself. But in terms of all the other things, so one big question is whether the integrity of the ocean, its health, will be really adversely affected by ocean acidification. And so warming of the oceans and ocean acidification both negatively impact many things in the ocean. I'm not an expert on marine ecology, but when I read the literature, it seems to parallel what we see in terrestrial systems, that the immediate response effects are almost all negative, but that there are inklings that there might be resistance or recovery through changes in species migrations, things of that nature that can buffer some of those worst effects. But ocean acidification is a huge problem.
I really like the idea of the increase all the biomes productivity by 1% or whatever it is. But is there an argument to be made to focus on certain biomes and not others, to increase some by 5% and others by 0.5% or whatever it might be? Like, why do all biomes have that same sort of 1% goal in terms of sort of communicating the challenge and the hope?
A great question, and I didn't mean, and obviously I need to change how I talk about it, to imply that the goal should be for us to increase everything by 1%. It's just the measure that we'd need to. And so certainly there are places like the tropical forests, which are more productive, where we could do more. We could pick and choose where we could do that. And we probably would need to pick and choose because certain parts of the world are going to be more at risk of adverse climate effects. So even if you're thinking about boreal forests, you'd be better off trying to promote that in moister, wetter places that are less likely to have, not that are going to have no fires, but have fewer fires and less likely to have any given forest burn. So I think your point is really well taken. Yeah. But we actually don't all recycle, and we don't, and we don't actually, what gets recycled isn't always recycled either. But no, but I think we need to be strategic about all of these things. And there's like agriculture, which contributes massively to climate change, can do a lot better because it's such an intensively managed system on an annual basis that there's a lot of room for smart agriculture to maintain productivity and reduce inputs a lot. And that's starting to happen, but it's going to happen in certain places more than others.
There's a question online. Peter, earlier in the presentation, in one of the slides, it may have been one of the models looking all the way out to 2200. I don't remember exactly which one it was. But the question is that you made a comment about not knowing how accurate some of the models are. And can you maybe just share a little bit more on that about understanding, uncertainty of models, whether it's for carbon storage, climate change, et cetera, and how does this uncertainty influence how we address ongoing climate change?
Yeah, that's another great question. We lump models together. Some models are actually pretty accurate and some are wildly uncertain. So when you get a forecast for the weather 4 hours from now, pretty good on average. The forecast for 4 months from now, no idea whether it's accurate or not. And so I think different models are going to serve us in different ways. And so, for instance, the predictions of climate change based on carbon emissions and other things, those have been incredibly accurate so far. Like James Hansen's original model is actually, our climate is tracking exactly what he predicted. And so the climate models, despite there being uncertainty about like how much will it warm for a certain amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, seem to be predicting very well. That doesn't mean that it predicts what's happening in East Texas and West Texas accurately. So sometimes in this case, you're probably much better predicting what's happening in the whole world than in a given area. And so there's certain places where they won't work as well. So I think we really have to, maybe those of us who talk about models, start talking about them differently so that the public can start to understand what each model is telling us and what it's not telling us. And certainly, when I show a model out to 2100 or 2200, it's really mostly there as a thought exercise, in essence. If this model is right, which we have no idea whether it is at that scale, this is what one possible future might look like. But that's very different than thinking like in 5 years or 10 years, what's going to happen to the forest or to the economy. So, a couple questions down here.
Hi, this was an amazing, inspiring talk. There was a couple of slides where you were talking about something about a $250 solution or something and kind of skipped over that. Is that a black box kind of solution? I mean, can you describe what you mean there?
Sure. What I meant by that was that if we think about the negative impacts of climate change on global economy year by year, and if the world had already warmed by 2.2 or 2.3 degrees, the bite out of the global economy would be 2.5 times greater. And so that's the dollar size of that impact. So the oceans and land ecosystems, by slowing climate change, have saved us that much money already, which is just a vastly enormous. I don't think I've ever seen anyone talk about quadrillions of dollars. But just that's the scale of these impacts.
Don't mention it to the guy that currently runs SpaceX. It's related questions. It's earlier on your slides, part of your $250 was the way species are taking carbon out of the atmosphere at higher rates. You also noted, though, that was harming many of those species. But in a little quick bit of good news, you said, well, things like maples sometimes can replace it and so forth. And that's also related to it. And so my question really is, if you let nature take its course, will it get there? And is that a 500-year deal or not? And that's related to the question we're often thinking about when forests, when the climate is making, say, forests unsustainable, existing forests, directing it to add different kinds of trees. I don't often hear people saying, there are certain trees that are especially good at capturing carbon. Now, maybe that's a synonym, meaning that they'll be good in the climate. Should, as we think about directing, should we also be thinking hard about specific species that are better at this than others?
Yeah, great question. It's kind of like Matt's question, but instead of where in the world, like how do you do it in a given forest? And so I think I may have lost the first part of the question was about the...
It's just saying, if nature...
Okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah, yeah. So I think nature, doesn't care about any of this, and nature, will survive us, even if we make ourselves go extinct, because not all the nature on the planet will go extinct. And so there will be species of various kinds on all the ecosystems, and eventually, 500 years or so, the things we measure about systems in terms of how productive they are and how species rich will probably recover. Now, that's way too long for us, given the timeline we need to be on with climate change. So I think because we care about surviving, and some of us also care about nature, but we need nature to survive even if we don't care about nature, we need to be strategic. And so when we think about, like, if you're managing for carbon, which trees, and so it gets complicated because certain trees might grow faster and store more carbon, but maybe they have more likely to die of disease or a drought. So you have to balance those things. And maybe someone cares about wildlife that inhabits certain species, not others. And so you have to think about all these co-benefits or other factors. And so I think people are thinking about that, but we don't have answers yet, even theoretically, let alone putting them into practice. But I think that's part of what's been happening here, and lots of people around the country and the world are experimenting both with planting in the ground, with using observational data, with models, trying to figure out how can we optimize as many of these things as possible in a way that actually works. And
I haven't heard people talking a lot about optimizing climate, as one, well, all the others. But I've never heard people say, as we think about this, let's also think hard whether this species
yeah.
is good at carbon. And if it is, maybe we let off a little bit on some.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think part of the reason we haven't is that we still don't understand these questions as well as we would like to. And so answering which forest or which species is going to do the best, we can guesstimate which one will grow the fastest and have the most carbon in the stems and live the longest. But when we talk about soil carbon, that's an area where there's so much diversity in the soil and the soil system that we don't have a good handle on which species are going to enhance that the most individually. And it actually gets back to this whole diversity debate. If species A, if red oak or redwood or eucalyptus or whatever, it grows the fastest and stores more carbon, why don't we just plant that and get rid of diversity? And so, there's the balancing of multiple things we care about in nature. But it's an important question.
I really like the conversation you're having about diversity, and I really want to talk about trees to understand that a little bit better from your perspective. So are you promoting diversity within the trees to grow wherever they want to grow? Perhaps, an example, an oak hickory forest. When the oaks die, maybe the maples take off, and all of a sudden we don't have an oak hickory forest. Depending where that's at. I understand the thought behind diversity, because if every tree was an ash tree, look where we would be. But how would you manage the forest? Or maybe you're saying we don't, and we allow the maples to take over the hickory forest, the hickory oak forest. And if that's true, I really want to know how you feel about honeysuckle.
So, so the question of, we might have ideas about what we want to do. Making them happen is often a challenge, even if we have a clear vision of what we want to make happen. We do have tools in our kind of management arsenal, so to speak. And so in some cases, if we have an oak forest and there's maple growing underneath it, and we want a mix of oak and maple, maybe you just leave it alone. That's the simplest and cheapest thing to do. But maybe in other cases, if you want something that's more shade tolerant and longer lived and stores more carbon in the long run, underneath a fast growing pioneer, maybe you need to plant it, because in that particular 50 hectares, there are no seeds or seedlings or seed trees around. And so I think the specific prescription for any given piece of land is not going to necessarily be the same. Now we can come up with general frameworks or guidelines for what to do. And I think in general, we have a number of ways in which you could make systems more diverse. And it's not just planting different species. The whole notion, maybe you need to start to plant maple and oak and spruce and fir genotypes from the driest, hottest part of the range, at least from a first principles guess, those should do better under hotter, drier conditions as it gets hotter and drier here. And people are testing some things, but there's many ways we can do this. And so I think honeysuckle, not very pretty in my opinion. Well, actually, the flowers can be nice, but and it doesn't store much carbon, and I don't know what it does for wildlife. It probably does something. Almost everything does. But basically, honeysuckle and buckthorn and other invasives, we do need to get smarter about how we try to control them, how much money we spend controlling them when it's not successful. But also, I think, and if other people lobby for this, need to start to think about how to incorporate them into our systems in a way that they're useful. And including me, most of us don't like that idea because we look at it and we say, oh, I don't want that here. But maybe we need to be smarter about some of that. Again, not necessarily specific to honeysuckle, but.
There we go. I have a question about the indigenous populations and the land that they own and protect and cherish. Are they being included in some of these studies? And are you seeing a difference in what's happening with their trees and forests and land as opposed to the other places that are being developed and ruined sometimes?
Yeah. Most of the large-scale analyses try to incorporate all lands. So, for instance, in the anything that's done remote sensing, indigenous lands would be included as well as others. And so most of the estimates you get at large scales include indigenous lands. And indigenous lands aren't uniformly managed by indigenous peoples either. Depending on where in the country or world you are, some indigenous groups have chosen to have very industrial kind of agriculture or forestry. Others don't. And so the notion that we can make a simple pronouncement about that isn't necessarily an easy one to do. And so I think we need to learn what we can from those who are doing a good job of it. But we also need to be careful about coming to conclusions about who's managing land best based on who they are.
From here, but oh, hi, people online. This is maybe a more broad question, but this was a very engaging presentation, and I think what you said about hope was very powerful. I wonder, as someone who's like working with the work of the work every day, what do you kind of tell yourself to keep yourself hopeful, and what are your kind of go-to management sources to like foster hope for yourself? I think that's interesting.
Wow, that's good. Maybe I need to give myself a dose of hope because often the world looks pretty bleak. I think what gives me hope is seeing people's spirit and energy for trying to make the world a better place, and also maybe trying to gain perspective from the long arc of history where things can look really terrible, even worse than now, and then somehow things turn around. And so people are resilient also. And so maybe those kinds of things. And then, like the rest of us, go get distracted and go for a walk or a bike ride or do other things and try to find joy in the world as it is. Because I think dwelling in the dark place of being depressed because of all the terrible things is neither good for mental health or doesn't make someone likely an effective person in anything they're doing. And so, you know, walking that line of not ignoring it but not letting it bring you down is a challenge. And those are the answers to that is for people, not me, for people whose profession is to help us figure out how to be healthy in these respects, in these times. But it's a really super important question.
We have time for one or two more.
It seems from the, you said the Unilever CEO has this message, and that, you know, corporations, big corporations are going to be the ones that have the power to do the most important change. So how are they paying attention? Is that a bestseller in the business circles? Is that message getting across? And I know that you mentioned greed will drive it, but are we there yet? How far away is that?
No, we're not there yet, unfortunately. But I'd say there's just as much movement and momentum in that sphere as there is in the governmental sphere around the world, which maybe is a really low bar. And so it's also a case where I also get hope from generational change and from people who can replace us and replace the CEOs of the companies, someone who grows up thinking about justice and climate change and diversity, maybe becomes a CEO, and maybe more of those CEOs behave like the former CEO of Unilever did. And so sometimes change, unfortunately, takes time. So I don't have a good answer to that, but I think there's some movement in that direction. But again, I think that's where governments and societies come into play. The role of governments in regulating corporations, which of course is a dirty word in this country right now, can help force corporations to do the right thing. And in a competitive world, if everyone has to do the right thing, you're not at a competitive disadvantage. And maybe society, you know, the fact that there isn't effluent coming out of the pipes of every factory in the United States, you know, doesn't necessarily hurt corporations once everyone is controlling their water pollution better than they did. So I think, and I think because the companies are multinational, they also sometimes are forced to move by only a certain segment of the world. So when the EU makes regulation about that you have to identify whether your supply chain involves, you know, really terrible labor practices, then even if you sell your product all around the world, you're going to do a better job of that to meet the EU. Just like California had a lot of power in the United States about mileage standards because it's such a big market. So I think it's complicated, but I think there's some reason to hope that things can be moved in that direction. But I'm not an expert in that, so.
Well, great. Well, I think we'll count that as our last question for the evening. But once again, please join me in thanking Peter.
Thanks all of you for showing up.
Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.